The morning began like any other for Daniel Hayes, a quiet, weathered ranch hand who had spent more years with horses and open fields than he ever had with people. He was riding back from the nearest town after delivering supplies. The sun still low behind a veil of pale clouds, winter was settling in early this year, and the frost clung to the earth in thin, brittle layers. The prairie felt unusually still, no birdsong, no wind. Just an echoing emptiness stretching across the land. Daniel preferred it this way. Silence suited him, but that morning something disrupted the familiar calm as he crossed a narrow trail that curved around a cluster of stunted pines. He noticed movement, small, fragile, almost ghost-like at first. He thought it was a fawn, maybe injured or separated from its mother, but as his horse slowed and he looked closer, his breath caught. It wasn't an animal, it was a girl. She stood barefoot on the hard, frozen earth, her toes pressed into the ground as though she had walked for miles without stopping. Her hair had been cut unevenly, hacked close to her scalp in some places and left jagged in others. As if done in haste or cruelty, she wore a thin dress far too light for the biting cold, its edges torn and stained. Her arms were wrapped around her small frame as she shivered violently. Daniel dismounted slowly, careful not to startle her. She looked young, no more than 14, maybe 15. Her eyes, dark and wide, darted between him and the trees behind her, as if expecting someone or something to emerge. There was a hollow terror in her expression, the kind that comes from seeing too much and understanding none of it. "Hey there," Daniel said gently. Keeping his voice steady, he was a man of few words. But even silence seemed too harsh for a moment like this. "You hurt? You lost?" The girl didn't answer. She flinched at the sound of his voice. Taking a step back, Daniel raised his hands to show he meant no harm. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, a sharp gust of cold wind pushed past them, making her sway as though she might collapse. That was when Daniel saw her feet, raw, bruised, and bleeding at the edges. Every step she had taken must have been agony. No child should have been wandering alone like this. No human being should have been left in such a state. He took off his coat, thick and lined with wool, and held it out. The girl hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes, but the cold eventually won. She reached forward weakly, her fingers trembling as she touched the fabric. When he wrapped the coat carefully around her shoulders, she did not resist. "There you go," he murmured. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Daniel didn't know who she was or where she came from, but he knew enough to recognize desperation. Someone had failed this girl, someone had abandoned her, and whether he liked it or not, fate had placed her directly in his path. He lifted her gently onto his horse, feeling the way she trembled uncontrollably. She barely weighed anything. As he climbed up behind her and urged the horse forward, she leaned into him, not out of trust, but out of exhaustion. Daniel tightened his arm slightly to steady her as the cabin drew nearer. One thought repeated in his mind: who could have left a child out here, alone, barefoot, nameless, and why? He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this unexpected encounter, would change both their lives in ways he could never have imagined. Daniel's cabin sat tucked beneath the rise of a small hill, a modest structure built of weathered logs and repaired. More times than he could remember, smoke drifted from its chimney in a thin, steady line, a quiet promise of warmth. As he rode in with the girl slumped weakly against him, he felt a mix of concern and uncertainty swirling through his chest, an unfamiliar weight he wasn't used to carrying. When he lifted her down, she swayed on her feet. Her small hands clutched the coat tightly around her shoulders. She looked at the cabin like it was something foreign, something that might vanish if she blinked. "It's all right," Daniel said gently, guiding her toward the door. "Just inside, warmth and food. That's all." The girl followed without a word inside. The room smelled faintly of old wood, dried herbs, and the stew Daniel had put on the stove that morning before leaving for town. He moved quickly, stoking the fire until the flames danced bright and full. The girl hovered near the door, at first hesitant, watching him the way a wild animal might watch a stranger, ready to run if he made a wrong move. "You can sit," he said. Nodding toward a chair near the fire, she didn't seem to understand at first. But when he gently gestured again, she crept forward, inch by cautious inch, and sat down stiffly. Heat washed over her, and Daniel saw her eyes flutter as though life were slowly seeping back into her limbs. Knelt and inspected her feet. They were in terrible shape, cracked, bruised, and red from exposure. He fetched warm water, cloth, and salve. "This'll sting," he warned. But she didn't react when he began cleaning. The wounds she barely even winced. That silence worried him more than anything. A child who didn't cry at pain was a child who'd learned too much of it already. "What's your name?" he asked softly. No answer. "Where are your folks? Someone looking for you?" Her eyes lowered. She shook her head once. Almost imperceptibly, Daniel realized then that it wasn't just fear keeping her quiet. She truly didn't know, or couldn't say when he offered her a bowl of warm stew. She stared at it for a long moment before taking the spoon with trembling fingers. She ate quickly, almost frantically at first, then slowed. As though embarrassed by her own hunger, Daniel pretended not to notice and instead busied himself tidying the table as she ate. He tried speaking again, slowly, gently, choosing simple words. "You remember anything? Where you came from? Any friends? Family? Your home?" Each time she only gave the same response, a tiny shake of her head, eyes dark with confusion, whether her memory was lost from trauma, or she was too afraid to recall. Daniel couldn't tell when she finally met his gaze. He noticed something he hadn't seen before: deep exhaustion. As if she had been running far longer than the hours her footprints suggested, something had chased her more than just distance. Something had terrified her into silence as daylight faded and shadows stretched across the wooden floor. Daniel set up a small cot beside the fire for her. She hesitated, climbing onto it, as if she expected punishment for resting. Only when he stepped back, giving her space, did she lie down carefully. Pulling the blanket to her chin, she stared at the flames, eyes wide open. Unable to sleep, Daniel kept his distance but stayed nearby, quiet, steady. A presence she could sense even without looking. He didn't know who she was, but he knew one thing for certain. This girl had been through something terrible. Something that had robbed her not only of her name and shoes, but of her sense of safety, and whether he intended it or not, he was now the only person standing between her and whatever darkness she'd escaped. The next few days settled into a fragile rhythm, quiet, cautious, but growing warmer in small, almost invisible ways. Daniel kept his distance just enough to avoid overwhelming the girl, yet close enough that she always knew he was there if she needed something still. She spoke very little. Her silence was not just fear. It was as if her voice had been locked away somewhere deep inside her. Daniel tried not to pry, but the mystery weighed on him. A child didn't end up wandering barefoot, injured and alone in the wilderness without a reason. Little by little, clues began to reveal themselves. The first came on the second morning. Daniel had stepped outside to chop wood, and when he returned, he found the girl sitting on the floor, staring at her reflection in a metal basin filled with water. Her fingertips hovered over the uneven stubble of her hair, tracing the rough edges left by whoever had cut it. Her face was blank, yet her eyes shimmered with something between confusion and pain. She looked up suddenly as if startled, brushing away a tear with the back of her hand, pretending it hadn't been there. Daniel didn't mention it, but he understood. The haircut wasn't just careless, it was deliberate. Somebody had stripped her identity piece by piece. Later that afternoon, a second sign appeared while tidying the cabin. Daniel heard a sharp crash. He rushed to the back room and found the girl crouched beside a broken mug, shaking violently, not from the cold, but from the sound it had made. Her eyes were wide, terrified. As if she expected someone to burst through the door and punish her, Daniel knelt beside her. "It's all right," he said softly. "It's just a cup, ain't no trouble." But she didn't move until he placed the broom into her hand slowly. Letting her sweep the pieces herself when she finished, he gave a small nod, not praise, just acknowledgement. She relaxed a little. Though the fear still clung to her like a shadow over the next days, she began communicating not with words, but with small gestures, sketches, and hesitant expressions. Daniel discovered she could draw surprisingly well when given a piece of charcoal and paper. She illustrated bits and pieces, fragments of memory floating back in confusing bursts. One sketch was of a crowded dock filled with ships. Another showed a group of people huddled together, their faces tired and frightened. A third drawing chilled Daniel deeply, dark shapes of men towering over smaller figures, their features harsh and jagged. And in one corner of the page, she had drawn herself barefoot, hair hacked short, eyes wide with terror. Daniel studied the drawings long after she fell asleep, his mind piecing together possibilities he didn't want to accept. She had not simply wandered away or gotten lost. She had escaped something or someone, and whoever they were, they had treated her less like a person and more like property. One evening, as snow drifted lazily outside the window, the girl approached Daniel holding a new drawing. This one showed a wooden crate with markings he didn't recognize. She pointed at it, then pointed to herself. Her expression tightened. "You came in one of these?" Daniel asked gently. Her lower lip trembled, and she nodded. The realization hit him like a fist. She had been transported like cargo. That meant criminal networks, human trafficking routes, smugglers who passed through remote areas where law was thin and mercy thinner. He looked at the girl, small, fragile, yet somehow still standing despite all she had endured. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Ain't nobody gonna take you again, not while I'm breathing." For the first time, she met his eyes without fear, just silent, aching hope in that moment. Daniel understood that protecting her wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the only thing he could do, because the shadows of her past were still out there and they would be coming for a few quiet days. The cabin almost felt like a sanctuary, a pocket of warmth, carved out against the cruelty of winter and the girl's shattered past. Daniel kept their world small and safe. He fed the horses early, chopped enough wood for the week, and taught the girl simple tasks to keep her mind occupied: stirring stew, folding blankets, sorting beans by color. She liked that one. It gave her hands something to do, something orderly, something she could control. But peace is fragile, especially when built on the edge of something dark. The first sign of danger arrived not at the cabin, but in town. Daniel had ridden in to pick up flour and tobacco, leaving the girl with clear instructions: stay inside, don't open the door for anyone but him, and keep the rifle by the hearth just in case. Not to use, but to remind her she wasn't helpless. When he stepped into the general store, the atmosphere shifted the moment the shopkeeper, old Finley, saw him. "Hayes," Finley muttered, leaning across the counter, "you been keeping an eye on any strangers out your way?" Daniel stiffened. "Why?" Finley lowered his voice. "Couple of fellas came through. Didn't give names, didn't need to. The type that don't belong anywhere decent." "What did they want?" "Looking for a girl," Finley said, tapping his finger on the counter. "Asian girl, said she ran away, claimed she stole something, but their story didn't sit right." Daniel's pulse tightened. "You tell 'em anything?" Finley's brows furrowed. "No, ain't my business what they're after, but from the look in their eyes, they ain't looking to give her a warm bed or a meal." Daniel left without finishing his shopping. On the ride home, he scanned the horizon constantly, every shadow sharpening his senses. He reached the cabin at full speed, breath tense, shoulders stiff. The girl was exactly where he'd left her, sitting by the fire, sorting beans. But when she saw his expression, she froze. Fear flickered across her face, old reflexes rising like ghosts. "It's all right," Daniel said quickly. Softening his voice, "Just need to talk." He explained slowly, two men asking questions, strangers sniffing around. Danger sliding closer on quiet feet. The girl's breathing turned sharp. She rose and backed toward the wall. Eyes wide and glassy. Her hands began to shake so violently the beans she held spilled to the floor. "They won't get you," Daniel said firmly. "Not while you're here, but we gotta be smart." And that marked the beginning of her training, not the kind that turned a child into a fighter. Daniel would never allow that, but the kind that could save her life if danger reached the cabin. He showed her the hiding place. Beneath the floorboards, covered with old quilts, where she could fit curled up like a cat, he taught her how to listen for footsteps, how to stay absolutely still, how to slip out the back window silently if she had to run to the creek bed and hide in the brush at first. She trembled whenever he mentioned bad men. Her past had carved fear deep into her bones, but slowly, very slowly, something shifted. She started asking questions with gestures. Where hide? What direction run? Which sound means danger? The fear was still there, but something new was growing over it, determination. The third evening after the warning, she pointed to the rifle on the hearth. Daniel shook his head gently. "No guns, I'll handle that part. Just stay smart. Stay quick. You're not alone anymore." Her eyes softened for the first time. She touched his sleeve lightly, a silent thank you. Snow fell in soft, deceptive flakes. Daniel spotted movement far across the field, two dark shapes approaching from the road. Moving with purpose, the men had found the trail and they were coming for her. The night the men finally arrived was a night carved out of ice and silence. Snow drifted thick and heavy, muffling every sound except the low whistle of wind through the eaves. Daniel sensed the danger before he saw it. A tension settled over him like his instincts were being pulled taut. He stepped to the window and wiped a clear circle in the frost. Two figures moved through the snow, lanterns swaying, their silhouettes sharp and unmistakably hostile. "Stay calm," Daniel whispered as he stepped away from the window, but the girl had already seen the fear in his eyes, and fear mirrored in her own. She rose from the table, backing toward the wall, trembling so violently that the old floorboards creaked beneath her feet. "It's them," she mouthed. Though no sound came, Daniel nodded once. "Go floorboards now." She hesitated, terror freezing her in place, but then heavy boots crunched outside, slow, deliberate steps that left no doubt. These men had come for her. The girl scrambled to the hidden space beneath the floor, curling in tightly as Daniel replaced the covering and dusted snow from his boots over the edges to disguise it. A hard, rattling knock shook the door, then another. "Open up." A gravelly voice barked. "We know she's in there." Daniel stepped forward, heart pounding like a drum. But he kept his face calm. He opened the door. Only halfway. Two men stood outside, thick coats, hard expressions, eyes that looked like they'd forgotten what mercy was. The taller one shoved a paper toward him. "We're looking for a runaway small Chinese girl. Belongs to us. Illegal cargo." Daniel's jaw tightened. "No girl here." The shorter man smirked. "Funny folks in town said otherwise. You boys need to move along." Daniel's tone sharpened. "Storm's getting worse." "We ain't moving." The tall man stepped forward, forcing Daniel back a fraction. "You hand her over now." "This goes easy." Daniel didn't budge. "I don't hand over children, not to men like you." The shorter man leaned in, his voice a poisonous whisper. "She's property." Behind Daniel's composed exterior, something old and dangerous ignited, a fire he hadn't felt in years. But before he could reply, the men shoved the door wide and barged in, sweeping the room with their lantern light. "Girl!" One shouted. "Come out." Under the floor, she flinched. Her breath quickened. She waited for Daniel to act, but then something inside her shifted. A memory surfaced. Voices shouting, hands grabbing, being locked in crates like animals. years of fear condensed into a single shaking heartbeat, and then the unexpected happened. She pushed aside the quilts, crawled out from her hiding space, and stood, trembling but defiant. No. She shouted. Her voice was small, cracking, but it was a voice. Her voice. The men spun around. Stunned, Daniel froze too, disbelief flashing across his face, not at her defiance, but at her courage. The shorter man lunged toward her. Daniel moved faster. He tackled the man to the floor, knocking the lantern from his hand. Flames flickered dangerously for a moment before sputtering out in the snow that had blown inside. The tall man swung at Daniel, but the girl, in a surge of instinct, grabbed a kettle from the stove and hurled it at the attacker's shoulder. It wasn't heavy enough to injure him, but it startled him, giving Daniel the opening he needed. The fight was brutal, clumsy, fueled by adrenaline and desperation, but in the chaos, neighbors, alerted by the dog's barking, began arriving with rifles and lanterns. Within minutes, the men were subdued, pinned to the ground, their threats silenced under the weight of a dozen watchful eyes. The girl stood trembling, but not with fear, with relief, with victory. Daniel rose slowly, blood on his lip, pride heavy in his chest. "You did good," he whispered. She looked up at him, tears running warm down her cheeks, and for the first time since he found her, she wasn't hiding from the world, she was fighting for her place in it. Morning broke with a fragile serenity, soft light spilling across the snow-covered landscape like a promise. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glittering. Daniel woke first, the exhaustion from the previous night weighing on him, but tempered by the quiet thrill of survival. For the first time in days, he felt safe enough to exhale fully. The girl was still asleep on the cot beside the fire, wrapped in the thick blankets Daniel had layered over her the night before. Her small chest rose and fell with steady breaths, a stark contrast to the ragged shivers and fearful twitches he had witnessed just hours ago. Daniel studied her quietly, noticing the subtle changes. Her hair, though still uneven, seemed softer in the morning light. Her eyes, even while closed, no longer flickered with panic. There was an undeniable calm now, the calm of someone who had survived a long, terrifying night. Carefully, he fed the fire, coaxing the embers back to life. The cabin no longer felt like a place of mere survival. It was a sanctuary, a threshold to a life neither of them could have imagined before. He watched the girl stir, and as she opened her eyes, she recognized him immediately, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. No words were needed. The bond forged in fear, sweat, and desperation was unspoken but undeniable. When she finally sat up, Daniel handed her a cup of warm water. "You're safe," he said gently. "No one's coming back for you." She nodded slowly, the enormity of that statement sinking in. For the first time, the girl felt the strange, thrilling sensation of agency, a life she could finally shape herself, a world she could step into without terror later. Once the cabin was tidy and the horses fed, Daniel prepared to take her to town. They would seek assistance from trustworthy community members, people who could help identify her origins, ensure she was legally protected, and provide education and stability. Yet even as he saddled the horses, he realized that a formal search might never reveal her past. She had lost more than shoes or hair, her name, her family. Her history were gone, but that loss no longer defined her. As they walked toward the town along the snow-crusted path, the girl stopped mid-step. Looking down at her bare feet, Daniel noticed her hesitation and smiled gently. He pulled from his saddlebags a pair of sturdy leather boots, laced and ready. "Here," he said, "a fresh start." She slipped them on carefully, marveling at the warmth, the protection, the strange sensation of comfort she had almost forgotten existed. It wasn't just footwear. It was a symbol of possibility, of life moving forward beyond the terror she had endured. When they reached the town, Daniel introduced her to the community members who could help, though her real name might never be discovered. The girl chose one for herself, a name that felt like sunlight after a long, frozen night. The act of naming herself was profound. It was the first time she could claim her identity without fear. Daniel watched her, pride swelling quietly in his chest. He had not only saved her life, he had witnessed her reclaim it. There was a new strength in her posture, a quiet determination in her gaze. She was no longer merely the frightened, barefoot girl he had found. She was a survivor, a person fully capable of shaping her destiny. As the sun rose higher, spilling golden light across the town and the surrounding fields, Daniel realized that the storm, terrifying and relentless though it had been, had done more than challenge them. It had forged a bond between two unlikely companions, a bond born of struggle, courage, and trust, a bond that promised more than mere survival. It promised hope and perhaps, in time, love. The girl looked at Daniel and smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips that conveyed gratitude, relief, and the faintest spark of joy. Daniel returned the smile, feeling the weight of the past days lift ever so slightly. Together, they stepped forward into the world, the snow crunching under their boots, hearts lightened by the knowledge that the worst was behind them and that the life ahead, unknown and uncertain, could now be theirs to shape. And in that moment, the cabin behind them, the storm outside, and the terror of the past all became part of a story that no longer controlled them, but one that had, unexpectedly, brought them together.